Hello everyone, thank you for joining me for a presentation on design basics and plant selection. If we're creating a new garden, before we even start to think about plants, there's so many other considerations we need to look at. And that's what we're going to do today. Look at all of these different considerations. So location, purpose of the garden, taking inventory of what's already there, the design principles, what garden style do you like, and maintenance. And of course, there are a couple other considerations, probably many other, but we can only look at some of them today. So the first consideration is location. And here we have a hardiness map that tells us that Ottawa is zone 5A. So you want to buy plants that will suit that zone and will survive our winters. Also dealing with location, the actual garden bed. Is it going to be in sun or shade? Is it exposed to high winds? Is it under a large tree or on the side of the house where the rain doesn't fall? These are all considerations that you need to take into account before you buy plants, because they will not survive. You need a drought-tolerant plant for the side of the house that doesn't get a lot of rain. You need a strong plant. Maybe the tall plants can't handle that wind, or you want to add some windscreen, some taller shrubs first to have a windscreen before you put in your delicate flowers. Those are all considerations. Another component that goes under location could be the soil condition. So you need to know if it's acidic or alkaline. Is it sandy, loam, or clay? And look at the topography. Are you putting this garden in a low-lying area? Is it going to have excessive moisture? Well, maybe that's a good spot for a pond, but not for your cactus. Are you on top of a hill, or is that hill exposed? Maybe you need some trees there for a windbreak. So you want to look at all that before you decide what plants you need. Then you need to look at the purpose of your garden or your yard. What do you intend to use it for? If it's going to be for recreation, maybe you need a big lawn for kids to play in. Is it just aesthetics? Do you want curb appeal? Do you want people to walk by going, what a beautiful garden? Maybe your goal is food production. And in that case, you're going to want to have lots of vegetables and fruit trees and nut trees, that kind of thing. Privacy could be another purpose or goal of your garden. In that case, you're going to add some trees and shrubs for a good privacy hedge. And another goal might be biodiversity. So inviting our native butterflies and bees and other wildlife into our garden. Here we're looking at a basic landscape design. This is half of a double in Ottawa. You've got your basic tree and some foundation planting. Let's look what they've done on the other half of the double. Quite a different garden. Both are legitimate, both are valid landscapes, and it really depends on what your goal is. Most of us as gardeners prefer the one on the right, but that's not to say the other one isn't a good landscape also. Okay, one thing we have to do when planning our new landscape, adding a new bed or just a whole new garden, is to look at what is there. Take an inventory of what you've already got. So that includes looking at all the trees on the property, the structures, the driveways, and of course you've also got to consider the trees on your neighbor's property because they affect your light also. Also important to know where your house is oriented, so where the sun exposure is, and easements like a hydro pad in the bottom left-hand corner. So then you look at your inventory and say, what do I want to keep and what do I want to get rid of? Well, let's assume the kids have grown up so you don't need that playground anymore. And you've also got maybe an obelisk or an arbor that's falling down, so you take that out. And the front landscape just doesn't have that curb appeal, the foundation planting, so let's rejuvenate that. Other things we don't want to take out, like the trees, the driveway we're obviously not going to change, the hydro pad we can't touch. So those are the things that have to stay. So here we have our blank slate now. We've taken out the things we don't want, and just the things that we plan to keep are still there. Let's look at where the sun, orients itself, crosses the property, so that you know which beds, what areas will have full sun and what will have some shade. You also need to look at where your windows and doors are, so you don't do any plantings or, construction in front of those areas. And easements. You need to know where your hydro line is, so probably best to call Ontario One Call and have them do a site locate so that you know where you don't want to dig. You don't want to break any power lines, gas lines, water lines, anything like that. And as I said earlier, you need to know your windows and doors, and that's because you need to plan your traffic flow. You need to be able to get to that back garden shed. Whatever you plan for the side doors, there's an entrance from your garage to get out to your side yard. And your entryway. You want to be able to get your visitors as economically shortest distance, but still a pleasant journey from the driveway to your front door. So now you're looking at your design and saying, okay, what do I really want to add, or what are my goals here? And you can make a list. And these are some of the things you might consider. And then you need to prioritize that list. So your number one goal might be to add some curb appeal and to hide an eyesore at the same time. So we'll rank those as number one. You want to add some entertainment space, some shade for that entertainment space probably, or for relaxing, and a vegetable garden. So those are our top 4 priorities. You can have more or less, but just make sure you note them and include them in your design. So it might look like this when you lay it out on your design. Well, we want to add the curb appeal to the front yard. So we're going to enhance the foundation plantings and walkway. We're also going to do something with the area around that hydro pad to try and hide that eyesore. And then number 2 and 3 were to entertain and add some shade. So that would obviously come off the back door so that you can have some privacy and have quick access to the kitchen, that kind of thing. And number 4 was to put a vegetable garden. And when we looked at the sun exposure, that area beside the garage made sense because it was in full sun. It also had good access to the garage so that you could get your tools and store your tools somewhere. So that's our general layout of what we, going to use these spaces for. So then you start sketching. So it might look something like this when you're done. We've got a bed around that hydro pad. You have to leave access to it, so don't put plants all the way around it. You can put something in front to kind of disguise it. Unify your design from one bed to the other, so the hydro pad bed to the front bed. Use some of the same plants, some of the same features like stone, and then that unifies it, makes it seem cohesive. Again, the pathway should be direct. But because you don't want people cutting through things, but also still make it inviting and decorative. So that's why a nice curving pathway works well. In the back, we've added a large patio and some sun sails for some shade. So if you're not familiar with sunshades, this is what they look like in practice. They're usually triangular. They are freestanding. Well, you have to add a support and then tie them to the house also. So they do need some good support. Probably best to not have them near something like a pine tree or a spruce tree that's going to drop needles, because you will need to clean those up off the sail. But they offer a good alternative to having a large tree beside your house and a good quality shade. So you need to kind of play with these. You can overlap them and see which works best. Watch the sun and figure out where you're going to put these so that you get the best benefit from them. You can take them down in the winter if you want more light in the house. And then the other thing was, I mentioned covering the hydro pad. Well, you can do that with a fake rock. These are available on the marketplace. They actually look fairly realistic, and if you combine some real rock with it, sometimes they blend right in. So it's just a good way to camouflage an eyesore like that. Now, we're going to look at the design elements and principles, and we're always going to do this with plant selection in our mind. The elements are the core issues of design. Think of those as the tools. And the design principles represent the visual effect of the elements. So the elements using those tools and how they look in the garden. The design elements are line, color, so looking at complementary, contrasting, neutral, focal point, monochromatic, all different ways we can use color, texture, whether something is airy, soft, or hard, form and shape. Form is three-dimensional, shape is two-dimensional, so conical versus triangle. Space and mass, i.e. the voids in the garden versus the occupied space. And movement, and that can be literal or figurative. So literally, grass is waving in the wind in your garden, and figuratively, how your eye moves through the garden and draws you in. So let's look at some of these individually, and we'll just do a quick picture or two of each so that you get the feel of it. Line, in this case, we've got like nice curving lines on this bed. We've got the straight lines of the grasses going up and the purple fountain grass, and then the arching seed head at the top, which kind of mimics the curving lines of the bed itself. Another example of line, very formal straight lines of the pebble pathway, lined by these dwarf conifers that, really draw your attention to that straight line. Color. And here we're looking at a bed in the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. And you can see they've done this bed in the color wheel colors. So we go from blues to mauves to pinks to reds and yellows and orange, and they all kind of follow along. So we can have hot colors. And I don't think anyone would argue that these are very hot colors, very vibrant colors, and cool colors. And quite often the colors are associated with the season. We'll see the cooler colors in the spring sometimes and the hot colors in July and August. Color echo is a term you'll hear also. There's three plants here. The heuchera is a little small in this photo, but you can see that the same tones of purple, shades of purple are in all three plants. So that's what we call color echo, where you see the color in the flower on one plant and it's echoed on the foliage of others. Could be in the stems, could be the foliage, but you see the color repeats, therefore unifying that little clump of plants. Texture. Lots of different plants in this photo that give you different texture. There's the sword-like spikiness of the daylilies, featheriness of these annual poppies, light airy spikes of the Perovskia Russian sage, and the rigid uprights of the verbascum right here. Then we've got coreopsis and the geranium in the background, adding some lightness there. So all kinds of different textures, which make it interesting. If everything was the same, it'd be pretty boring. And in the shade garden, we can have lots of different textures too, and sometimes we rely on that even more because we don't have as many blooming plants in the shade garden. This shows some hostas with fern and heuchera and rock. Now in this case, the rock probably should be bigger to be a bigger contrast, but it gives the feel of it. You can see there's the feathery lightness of the fern and the hardness of the rock versus the wrinkly texture of the rubbery leafed hostas and the delicate heucheras below. This photo, again, lots of different textures. We've got the pennisetum, light airiness, featheriness blowing in the wind, rubbery texture of the sedums in the foreground, lots of leafy things, spiky things, delicate, harder. So lots of contrast there. And then the flowers and plants themselves will give you form and shape. We can see that the delphiniums, although yes, they are all individual little columnar type flowers, quite often you'll have one, the main one, the primary flower of that plant goes taller than the secondary blossom. So you kind of get that triangular shape. You also get the mounding shape of other little perennials and shrubs. So the plants themselves can give you shape and texture. So let's look at some different plants and how we can add those shapes and form into our landscape. We've got trees that are triangular in shape. This little conifer down below is also quite triangular in shape. As I mentioned, lupins and delphiniums often have that primary flower that's so much taller than the secondary flowers, so you get that triangular shape. And the Kniphofia, the red hot poker, each individual bloom has almost a triangular shape to it. Round shapes in the landscape. There are a lot of trees that have that very round shape once they mature. This looks like a maple. Red buds, very round in shape. Heucheras form a nice mound. The individual leaves are kind of round, but then also the whole plant forms a mound. A little looks like a globe cedar, and then there's teddy bear sunflowers that form big pom-poms that again look like little globes, little circles in your garden. Columnar shape, upright shapes, triangular, not triangular, rectangular almost. Here we have a columnar oak, an upright juniper, Calamagrostis Carl Forster, again, very upright, very rectangular looking. And the Arameris or foxtail lily, again, looks very upright and columnar in the landscape. Vase-shaped. We have a little dwarf, looks like a lilac in the vase shape. A lot of conifers come in that shape. Little juniper here. Baptisia early in the season. By August, it's sprawling a bit and the leaves are drooping more. But early in the season, when it's blooming, it's very vase-shaped. And then individual flowers, like this little mallow flower, looks very vase-shaped. Space and mass. And here you're looking at kind of the yin and yang, the parts of the landscape that have plants and things that draw your attention versus the voids, the areas with nothing, where it's a resting place for your eye. If everything was filled in, it would look way too busy. So having voids in the landscape, and that can be a lawn, it can be the plain interlock, or in this case, it looks like paving. Mass plantings work well, but that's not exactly what we mean by mass. Mass, we mean, in this case, means the space that's filled by any given grouping or object itself. And in the back, we have what looks like hydrangeas mass planted. So again, it gives you the look of a lot of things together filling that space. Movement, and here we're looking at the how the eye is drawn through by following this path and how it literally pulls you through. So you're moving through the garden because you want to see what's around this corner. So now the design principles, that's using the tools, the elements we just talked about, and how we use them in the garden gives you a visual effect. So repetition, rhythm, emphasis, balance and symmetry, proportion and scale, unity and diversity. Repetition and rhythm. This first photo says it all. I mean, we've got the repetition of the color of the flowers. The yellow goes on in each of these little half moon beds. We've got the blue behind it and the lighter lemony yellow behind that. We also have the shapes that are repeated. So we have the clipped hedge here and the clipped balls on the end of each of these beds. That repeat, 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 and draw you through, draw the eye to the very end. We also have repetition of the trees on this side and new trees coming in on this side. So you can really see the repetition and the rhythm, how it all flows together because these things repeat. So therefore, it just adds a rhythm in your mind as you're walking through. You see the same thing, it's familiar, and it draws you through the garden. Emphasis or focal point. Here we have a beautiful Japanese maple that's been pruned up to expose the beautiful structure of the branches. And it's really set off by the green background. The red foliage really shows up. The structure of the tree with all the branches shows up because of the beautiful green background. We've got a large planting of ferns here. We've got the mass planting of the latest mantle here and other greenery all around. So focal point can be a plant, can be a structure, can be a statue, an ornament, and it can change throughout the seasons. If you have a beautiful rhododendron or azalea blooming in the spring, that could be your focal point. But then when the season changes, it's now just a green background plant and something else may step to the foreground as your focal point. Balance and symmetry. This is looking at visual impact. It's not about everything being matchy-matchy. So when you have the hedge in the background and a hedge in the foreground, they're not the same exact hedge, they're not the same size, but they do balance each other out. Some might even think that sofa balances out with this hedge. And in this photo on the lower right, we have a more natural setting, but nonetheless, we're seeing balance and symmetry. The weight of the stone is certainly much heavier than the weight of these ferns, but visually, they have the same impact or weight. Same with these two trees, totally different trees, but visually, their impact is balanced. They have the same visual impact. Proportion and scale, very important. Here we have a large garden, so it can handle a large lawn, a large patio, a large border with a large arbor. So think of what the size of your garden. Just because you have a small garden doesn't mean you can't put big things in, but you have to be selective and maybe only put one in, like a nice tree, and again, maybe go for something columnar or something that you can espalier if you've got a limited space. So unity and diversity, basically saying that you want things that look similar, but not so similar that everything is boring and looking the same, and things that are different, but not everything looking different, or else it would be too hard on the eye and not unified at all. So what we have here are two shrubs, Daphne burkwartii Carol Mackey and a variegated dogwood, and you can see that they have the same color palette. Totally different texture in the foliage, but on the same color palette, so they work together. This picture kind of sums things up for me. It's showing you the repetition and rhythm. We've got the colors repeating throughout. We've got the textures repeating throughout. We've got the plant material repeating. We have emphasis. We have this bench as our focal point and a destination. So we go down this pathway and our eye goes down to this bench. Balance and symmetry. We have similar plants on each side. We have the sedums on each side, so that adds balance. We also have a lamppost here behind the bench and a tree off to the left, and they also add the uprights, the balance and the symmetry there. Visually, we've got the weight of the coreopsis, the weight of the creeping juniper, and again, that offers some balance. Proportion and scale, well, everything certainly looks good together in this big open space. The mass plantings certainly help. If we only had small plantings, they probably wouldn't look as good. So everything seems to be in proportion and scale. And we've got unity and diversity. We've got different colors that work well together. We've got the blues of the fescue in the foreground, the glaucous blue of the junipers, the creeping junipers in the background, and more blue scattered throughout. We've got the different yellows that work together. We've got plant material that repeats, therefore unifying everything. So everything really does work together. And I'm just going to borrow this quote from Joe Reardon Smith, and it sums it all up. A border, no matter how big or small, should have rhythm. Repetition of key plants gives structural and color flow. The brain looks for similar forms, and this carries the eye along and around a border, giving movement and cohesiveness. And a good way to get this repetition in your garden, especially if you're creating a new bed, is to take material from an existing bed and plant it in the new bed. Now they have things in common. So it's not a totally new alien bed in your garden. It's something that fits in with your existing beds. And one last thing that's not really a design principle, but to me, a garden should always be a journey of discovery. You should wander through and get hints of what's to come that make you want to go a little further. This wonderful statue in a garden, Hudson, Quebec, you don't see it full on. You just catch glimpses of it as you go around corners. It makes you want to go see what is there. What is that? Another example, this is a woodland garden. You're walking through a little pathway surrounded by trees and shrubs, and then there's a little window to a pond. But you can hear running water, and this is still water. So you're curious now, where's that running water coming from? And you continue on up the path. You come to a clearing, and you see this beautiful fountain. So that's what I mean by journey of discovery. Not everything revealed at once, so that you are lured into the garden to see what lies ahead. Garden styles. Now, this is personal taste. As a generality, we have formal and informal, but within those, we have different styles of garden. Formal usually has straight lines, usually very balanced and symmetric. Repetition of a smaller group of plant material versus a lot of different type of plants. And there are examples of the formal gardens in the history books of Baroque, French parterre, Rococo. And informal gardens are the opposite, curving lines. They can be asymmetric or symmetric. A lot of diversity of plants. And examples of those would be cottage gardens and Asian gardens to some extent. And we don't have Versailles anymore, and it's not realistic for our lifestyles, but we have still some formal type gardens. So looking at these, you see the straight lines, you see the plant material isn't necessarily totally balanced and formal, but definitely the straight lines, the focal point being, in this case, the sundial. Here we've got balance, so we've got the same plant material, the same beds, boxwood with a tree, very straight formal pathway. Again, balance here in the two planters, and we have another little design up in the top right-hand corner, which shows another raised bed for vegetables, but still somewhat formal in the straight lines and the limited use of plant material. Versus these gardens, which just seem to be more informal. There's less straight lines. The plant material is very diverse. It feels more natural, much more open space. But it doesn't have to be a big open space. You can have a very informal garden in your tiny little townhouse backyard also. Maintenance is a big consideration when you're planning a new garden. And just remember, there's no such thing as a maintenance-free garden. There are more low-maintenance plants. Nothing is maintenance-free. They're living things. They need some care. But what I look at when I'm considering plants to be low maintenance, does it have a long bloom period? Does the foliage look good all season? Does it produce a lot of seed? I don't want to be picking out little seedlings all of next year, or religiously deadheading and not letting it go to seed. Does it need a lot of shaping? Does it look good on its own, or do I have to groom it? And does it flop? There are a lot of great plants, but if they don't have strong stems and you're picking them up out of your pathway or going around staking them and making them look unnatural, then is that a plant you want in your garden? And does it need special growing conditions? And for that, I'm talking about something like a rhododendron that likes some acidic soil. Is it worth your trying to change the conditions of your property just to grow a single plant? It's an example of a low maintenance garden, in my opinion. It's a small backyard garden. She's done a lot of things right to make sure the maintenance is minimal. The grass is not a perfect lawn. It's a mixture of clover and grass. It does have weeds. She does hand pick where she can, but it's not a perfect lawn by any means. She's got edging in, not to everyone's taste, but it does keep that mulch to the one side and is a little less work than doing a clean edge on it. The plants themselves are mostly perennials and shrubs. They offer color all season. Most of them are low maintenance from that point of view. Don't need a lot of water or fertilizer. In fact, this lady never waters. And she's put in black mulch. That was her choice for color. It kind of fades in the background and makes the plants pop. Mulch is a good idea just for conserving moisture and keeping weeds down. So that adds to its low maintenance. Another design, this is actually my garden, my front yard. I've got a cottage style garden and it's got plants chock-a-block. That is a good way to keep weeds down also. Don't give them any light or soil to grow in. If you have your plants spaced quite closely together, they will choke out weeds. Now, there is still weeding to do. There's mostly perennials here, and there's a good thick layer of mulch, so that helps. And I try not to water, so having the mulch definitely makes a difference for these plants. This would be more of an Asian style garden, and if you look at it, it looks a little sparse, but these grasses, this is very early in the season, they will get more height on them, and it will help with the look. I like the use of the thyme as a ground cover. It just makes everything neat and clean. The rocks, the river rock echo, the big stone, softened by all the ground covers. Now, I do think this needs a little more height. Ideally, a Japanese maple in the front left corner, but this was the only picture I could find, so you get the idea. Just add some height, balances things a bit. In fact, I think I would still want to see a couple more shrubs in this just to give it a little more balance, add a little more privacy, and a little more oomph. This one kind of is a version of the previous garden, so we get some of the rock work still there, the river walk, the walk pathway. This one does have a big tree and more shrubs, so it does add that height and more year-round color and interest. Now, I would like to see some of those thymes mixed in here and ground covers just to fill it in a bit. And I think combining those two gardens together would be a great idea. There are other considerations that you would want to think about for your plant selection, such as multiple seasons of interest. If a plant only blooms for 2 or 3 weeks, well, that foliage better look good the rest of the year, or else it's just using up space and being an eyesore in your garden. And you can have personal reasons for wanting to grow something. For instance, we know many people that have peonies or plants in their garden from their grandmother, or multiple generations even. So that could be an emotional reason for why you want to grow something. The environment is a big concern. Everyone wants pollinator plants. Everyone wants diversity and natives. So another reason why you might choose a certain plant. And pests. There are so many pests now that have become problems, in particular the red lily beetle and the Japanese beetle, that people are, doing their research before they select a plant, and it's obviously a good idea. You don't want to put in a rose garden if you're in an area that has a lot of Japanese beetle, because roses are one of their favorite food. And we'll look at plant health also, and this is like deciding in advance when you're buying the plant at the point of purchase, is this a good healthy plant to add to my garden? Some individual plants that just demonstrate the multiple seasons of interest I was talking about. This is a small tree, Heptacodium myconoides, or seven sunflower. It's often a multiple stem tree trunk, not a single trunk. So it looks kind of like a tree, but a shrub, and it's got this beautiful exfoliating bark that you can see all season. It blooms, but it blooms late in the year when you don't have a lot of trees and shrubs blooming. So it blooms in September. And then if the season's long enough, it's followed by these beautiful red bracts that you see that replace the flowers and are quite colorful in their own right, and the foliage itself looks good all summer. It doesn't have a lot of pests, doesn't have browning of the tips, so just a good overall tree all summer, except then it does its show in September through October. The pear tree and any fruit tree would really work here, but I just wanted to demonstrate that they're beautiful when they're in flower. To me, they're a work of art if they're pruned properly. The flowers themselves are beautiful, and of course you get fruit off of it. So to me, that's multiple seasons of interest. Peony, and this is a species peony, Paeonia molliquitsii, or Molly the Witch. Beautiful glaucous foliage, holds the water in little droplets. Foliage looks good all season, comes in either pink or yellow, and quite often you'll get these beautiful seed heads that are colorful on their own. So again, a good plant, multiple seasons of interest. The ornamental rhubarb, it emerges as quite a beautiful pink color, changes to plain green, but the underside is still that pink color. Quite a stately plant in the garden. Flowers aren't that significant, but just the height alone makes it a showpiece in the garden. And the foliage does look good most of the summer. There'll always be new leaves coming out. You will have to pick off some of the browning leaves though, because they will become unsightly. And of course, if you don't have room for the big ornamental rhubarb, nothing says you can't grow regular rhubarb in your garden. No reason you can't mix ornamentals with, vegetables with your ornamentals. The Podophyllum peltatum, one of our native plants. This is the May apple. And I love it when it first emerges. To me, it looks like Batman. And then, of course, it has this little flower under the leaves as they unfurl completely, followed by an edible fruit. Fruit is only edible when it's fully ripe, and you don't want to eat too many of them or you will have a tummy ache. And it, depending on the summer, and if you've got it in some moist shade, it will remain green all summer. In a drought year, it will go dormant and come back the following year. We talked about plant selection for sentimental reasons and the peony in specific, because we all know that they are long-lived plants and we often inherit them from family members. So they're important to us, but also there's a movement towards planting trees for special occasions, the birth of a child or graduation. And this saying just is perfect. The best time to plant an oak tree was 25 years ago. The second best time is today. They will take a long time to mature. You're planting for the next generation, but it's still so worthwhile to do. This is a front yard garden near Woodlawn. Dr. Jeff Skevington is an entomologist, and he wanted to create a prairie grassland garden. So he got special permission from the city to do this because obviously it doesn't meet bylaws, but it in its own right is a beautiful little garden. At the stage when I was visiting, just the grasses were looking their best. The Rudbeckia was coming out, but it also had all of these other plants in there: Liatris, Echinacea, variations of the Rudbeckia. So they can be quite beautiful. Of course, it was just humming with bees and butterflies flitting in and out. Here's another beautiful wildflower garden. This is out in Ashton. It's the garden of Darlene Scales, who used to be a master gardener. She planted about 2 acres of all wildflowers. It's got grasses, it's got Rudbeckia, goldenrod, turtlehead, echinacea, even wild roses. She's done pathways all the way throughout. Beautiful garden. And of course, it all has all kinds of wildlife, bees and butterflies and monarch caterpillars, not to mention the fact that it is a certified backyard habitat by the Canadian Wildlife Federation. So she gets all kinds of native bugs and birds flying into her garden. There are some wildlife that we don't invite into our garden. In fact, we want to deter them from coming into our garden. Deer and bunnies would be 2 of those. So sometimes plant selection will help with that. If you can select plants that have strong scent, fuzzy foliage, they seem to detract or deter these animals. But usually a fence or a repellent is the best way to keep them out. Now, I talked about this, plant health at the point of purchase, and here we are going into it in a little more detail. And you want to select a healthy plant when you're buying it. That's pest and disease free, has a good rooting system, and looks like it has vigorous growth. So 2 plants in a nursery, obviously you're going to pick the one on the right. The other one looks like it's either been underwatered, underfed, has a poor root system, something's going on there. It's not as healthy as the one on the right. So there you can see what a good root system looks like. The one on the right is a good root system. The one on the left is already yellowing and going round and round. This one's actually going downward, and can be separated and spread out properly into a new planting hole. So but we can't always find plants like that. So sometimes you do buy the ones that are going round and round. This one is still good, white, healthy roots. You need to gently tease these roots apart. Sometimes the easiest way to do that is put the whole thing in a pail of water and give it a good soak and wash all that soil off. Then when you have the roots free, you can spread them out properly. Roots should not be growing round and round. They should be spreading out into the ground. That way they will be more drought tolerant and be able to pick up more nutrients from a larger area and just be an overall healthier plant. And sometimes you really want that plant, the root system's not that healthy, but you're willing to take the chances and you can't tease them apart. So sometimes you do have to resort to just cutting them apart. And then at least you can spread them out a bit and trying to encourage them to go outward. Now, Jeff Mason of Mason House Garden posted these photos and I got his permission to add them to my presentation. He's got 3 little echinaceas in here. And he posted this because he had a customer come back and said, "Are you growing or selling those annual echinacea again?" And he said, "Well, they shouldn't be annual." She said, "Well, they never live, but I like growing them." And so he said, "Well, I want to show you the difference in plant selection." So when you go to the nursery, you might be faced with these 3 plants. Which one would you buy as the healthiest plant? Well, the choice is this one in the middle with no flower. It's got good, healthy crowns, lots of leaves that are feeding that crown. And then your second choice would probably be this one because it's got more leaves at the crown again. You'd have to sacrifice this blossom, which I know is very hard to do, but that would put the energy back into the crown and developing more flowers for next year and a good, healthy root system. And of course, this would be your last choice because it's got next to no leaves feeding that crown for next year, if there is even a crown for next year. And it's all in the details. So keep some records. When you look at a plant like Perovskea and you read the tag, it will tell you that this is called Little Spire, and it says it's only a meter wide by a meter tall. Well, then it says it may need some pruning to be kept short. So it's not really a short plant. It's a short plant if you keep it pruned. So this goes back into maintenance and how much you want to do to your plant. So probably in June when it's up about 2 feet, you'd cut it back by, a third to a half, and that would shorten the overall plant. But on the label, it should tell you all the details of when it's going to bloom, what the foliage looks like, what its shape is, what its texture is. And like I said, if you keep some records, then you know what you've got planted next to each other, and you know where there's going to be a hole or some extra work needed. And you can put as much information in there as you'd like. And a couple slides just to show you putting all of this information together and hopefully making it work. Some great landscapes, large gardens, so massive beds. This was on an OHA tour a few years ago. Large pergola, Very young garden, basically built in a farmer's field, so they've added lots of trees. Eventually there will be good shade, but for now they're just small trees. And continuity of blooms, good choice of texture, shapes, colors, lots of things going on that are working in this garden. A smaller scale garden, this is in the UK, so don't think all these plants will bloom at the same time here. But if you've got a sheltered area by a wall, sometimes you can get things to do out of season. Again, chock a block full. Don't give the weeds a chance. Put some annuals in the front if there's space. Tall, spiky things, sword-like foliage, little dainty pink blossoms coordinating with the darker pink, and then some mauves over here. Tall, spiky accent plants, using the wall behind to have a backdrop of color. Again, a good overall landscape that works. A friend's backyard garden in Brockville. Again, it's her little oasis, but everyone gets to enjoy it because she's on a corner lot. The plantings by August are quite tall and give her a bit of privacy. There are also some shrubs in there for year-round privacy, but you get the tall helianthus and the echinacea even are tall. That looks like Cimicifuga here, more echinacea back here. Everything's working well. It's got lines, but they're not all straight lines. The borders are straight lines, and she's got island beds and pathways throughout that aren't straight lines. Good mixture of textures and color, good shapes and forms, good flow. Everything seems to work in this garden. Shady garden, a little harder to see, but the focal point is the Japanese maple that's been pruned up. And I'm sure at some point she wondered why she'd done that because it probably was blocking the front walkway. But it paid off in the long run because once she was able to limb it up and just have the upper branches, it just makes it such a statement, a focal point for this garden. And it's underplanted with lots of good shade plants and some colorful annuals that gives multiple all summer long interest, and hostas, ferns, heuchera, lots of good plantings in there. Little backyard garden, slightly formal, not completely formal, just, the layout itself is a bit formal with the uprights at the back, the pathway going through. Good use of the tree here for different textures, the smooth bark, and then the canopy overhead. Good choice of plantings, repetition of the glaucous blue foliage with some of the hostas over here and plantings over here. Again, things just work with the different textures, the different shapes, the airiness of this grass, letting you see through the airiness of that trunk to the plantings at the back, to the focal point of that fountain. Couple more backyard gardens using good mix of hardscaping with softscaping. One looks a little newer than the other. This one on the left looks a little more established. Both good examples, good use of a small space, making it look bigger, and very functional. Just as a destination point, a seating area to look back over your garden and enjoy it. This is, of course, up at Rockwall Gardens, Judy Wall's garden. Just a different style of garden, using the right plants for the right place. You're not going to get the same height and things that you might in a traditional garden just because it is a rock garden, but you can still have the features of the different textures with the rock, the smaller stone, the cushiony softness of the hens and chicks and all the other little alpines. Again, using your colors and textures to advantage to make it interesting all season long. Florette Huneau's garden in Gloucester. This was an experiment she did when she was a master gardener. She wanted to show that you could do a drought-tolerant garden, so good environmental garden, and she did it on her front lawn. So she put in 3 beds. There's actually 3 beds here. There's one in the middle, and then this one at the back. She's got some shrubs for height, There's a big pagoda dogwood near the house, provides her some shade. And all of these plants have never been watered. They only get water when it rains, and they're thriving. They were planted in the lasagna style method, um, raised bed on top of the lawn. The lawn has been had lots of clover added to it, never gets watered either, no pesticides, and it's a perfectly happy, very environmentally friendly, mostly native plant garden. And of course, you can always add some vegetables to your ornamental garden. They can be quite decorative. We see by the different cabbages and kales and things. Lettuces can be quite ornamental. Tomatoes are beautiful when they're showing color on the fruit. So don't feel you have to keep those separate. They will both benefit from each other from the pollination. So thank you very much for watching. That's the end of the presentation, or more accurately, this photo shows the butt end of my dog, Rufus, and he was digging out a chipmunk. So luckily the plant survived, the chipmunk survived, and so did Rufus.